Something unusual is unfolding in Washington, driven not by partisan rivalry, but from within Donald Trump's own political base. As Trump expands the use of emergency powers, resistance is emerging from Republican lawmakers who once defended his authority. This rare internal pushback reflects growing concern that institutional responsibility and constitutional balance are beginning to outweigh party loyalty, signaling deeper anxiety about the future of governance and executive power. Emergency powers have always occupied a dangerous space in American politics. They are legal tools designed for crises, not convenience. Trump's recent declarations, framed as necessary responses to national security and economic threats, have reignited fears that executive authority is being stretched beyond its intended limits. For many Republicans, the issue is no longer about supporting Trump's agenda, but about preserving Congress's role as a co-equal branch of government. At the center of the controversy is Trump's belief that decisive leadership requires speed, not deliberation. He has repeatedly argued that bureaucratic checks slow down necessary action and weaken America's global position. But critics inside his party warn that bypassing Congress sets precedents that future presidents could exploit in far more dangerous ways. What once looked like strength now appears to some lawmakers as institutional erosion. Several Republican senators have openly questioned whether Trump's emergency declarations align with constitutional intent. While careful with their language, they emphasize that emergency authority was never meant to function as a permanent governing model. Their concern is not ideological disagreement, but the normalization of executive shortcuts that reduce legislative oversight to an afterthought. The war powers framework has suddenly returned to the center of political debate. Republicans who once dismissed it as outdated now see it as a necessary restraint. Trump's willingness to hint at military options while operating under emergency declarations has raised alarms about how easily the country could be pulled into conflict without full congressional approval. Trump's response to internal resistance has followed a familiar pattern. Rather than negotiating or clarifying limits, he has framed opposition as obstruction. Public statements emphasize loyalty, urgency, and threat, creating an atmosphere where disagreement is portrayed as national risk. This approach has deepened the rift inside the party, transforming policy debate into a question of authority. What makes this moment different is that the dissent is procedural, not political. Lawmakers are not attacking Trump's ideology. They are questioning his method. This distinction matters because it reflects concern for the system rather than the individual. Once lawmakers begin defending process over personality, the balance of power shifts in subtle but lasting ways. Emergency declarations also reshape public perception. By framing issues as crises, the executive gains narrative dominance, while Congress appears slow and reactive. Republican critics warn that this dynamic weakens democratic accountability by conditioning voters to accept rule by urgency rather than rule by law. Behind closed doors, anxiety is growing. Republican leaders privately acknowledge that unchecked emergency authority could eventually be used against their own priorities. The fear is not Trump alone, but the precedent he leaves behind. Power once expanded rarely contracts willingly. This internal conflict reveals a broader truth about modern American governance. Institutions are under stress not because of external enemies, but because of internal impatience. The question facing Republicans now is whether preserving party unity is worth sacrificing constitutional restraint, or whether drawing limits today prevents deeper damage tomorrow. As debates intensify, constitutional scholars are increasingly referenced by lawmakers who fear that emergency powers are becoming a substitute for legislation. Republicans pushing back argue that governing through declarations undermines the very framework conservatives claim to defend. Their concern is that once Congress accepts marginalization, restoring its authority becomes far more difficult than losing it. Trump's defenders insist the emergency measures are lawful and justified, pointing to historical precedents where presidents acted decisively in moments of national strain. But critics counter that legality does not equal legitimacy. They warn that constant reliance on emergency authority blurs the line between temporary action and permanent executive expansion. Inside Republican caucuses, conversations have shifted from political messaging to institutional survival. Lawmakers are no longer asking how to defend the president publicly, but how to protect congressional relevance privately. This recalibration reflects a recognition that unchecked executive power eventually weakens every branch except the one holding it. The political risk is real. Opposing Trump carries consequences within the party base, yet remaining silent carries consequences for governance. This tension has produced cautious statements, procedural objections, and carefully framed votes designed to assert limits without provoking direct confrontation. Trump, however, views these moves as personal challenges. His rhetoric increasingly frames resistance as betrayal rather than disagreement. This personalization of power deepens mistrust, making compromise harder and reinforcing fears that authority is being centered on individual will instead of institutional balance. Emergency powers also affect global perception. Allies watch closely as internal checks weaken, while adversaries take note of decision-making concentrated in fewer hands. Republicans raising concerns argue that credibility abroad depends on stability at home, and that unpredictability at the top creates strategic vulnerability. The situation exposes a broader pattern in modern politics where speed is valued over structure. Trump's approach emphasizes rapid response and dominance, while critics argue that restraint is not weakness but safeguard. This clash of philosophies now defines the internal Republican divide more than ideology ever did.